When Putin's closest ally says we are at war with the West, he's not speaking in metaphors. In Russia, words like that are never accidental. They are signals, they are tests, and this one may be the most dangerous in years. Because once a nuclear power starts describing peace as war, reality begins to shift with it. The front line moves from the battlefield to the narrative itself, and in that space, the smallest misunderstanding can trigger consequences no one planned for. On October 25th, Dmitry Medvedev, former president of Russia and now deputy head of the country's Security Council, declared that Russia is at war with the West. The statement came during a televised address in Moscow, delivered with the calm tone of someone announcing a fact, not a threat. According to Reuters, it was the first time a senior Russian official framed the confrontation in such explicit terms. Medvedev is not a marginal voice. He sits at the core of the Kremlin's power structure, often acting as the messenger for what Putin cannot yet say publicly. When he speaks, it reflects a coordinated decision, not a personal opinion. His words suggest that Moscow is ready to redefine its confrontation with NATO, not as a proxy conflict through Ukraine, but as a direct systemic struggle against the West itself. In this video, we'll break down what this statement really means, why its timing matters, how it fits into Russia's broader strategy, and why it could reshape how the United States sees its own security. If you want clear analysis without hype, subscribe to SafetyZone. Medvedev's words would have sounded unthinkable 2 years ago. Back then, the Kremlin insisted that the special military operation in Ukraine was limited, defensive, and regional. Now, one of its highest-ranking officials calls it a war against the entire West. That is not rhetoric. It is a psychological shift with operational consequences. In Russia, language has always been a component of strategy. Before weapons move, narratives change. Before troops advance, citizens are taught why they must. That tradition runs deep. During the Second World War, Stalin described the Nazi invasion as the Great Patriotic War, turning national trauma into moral duty. The Soviet system learned that control of vocabulary meant control of behavior. Every generation since has inherited that lesson. When Medvedev says, "We are at war with the West," he is not simply echoing Kremlin anger, he is activating a cultural reflex, survival through unity, unity through fear. By repeating those words, Moscow trains its population to accept escalation as natural, even righteous. That conditioning matters. It shapes how soldiers fight, how factories work, how civilians interpret sanctions or losses. Once a society begins to see itself as besieged, every sacrifice becomes justified, and every act of aggression feels like defense. And once that perception hardens, restraint turns into weakness, and compromise into betrayal. For the United States, that mental shift inside Russia is dangerous because it erases the boundary between political theater and real confrontation. During the Cold War, the world learned how fragile that boundary can be. The Cuban Missile Crisis did not start with missiles. It started with the belief that both sides were already locked in total conflict. The same pattern repeated in Georgia in 2008, in Crimea in 2014. In every campaign where the Kremlin first declared a moral siege, then acted to defend itself. Today, that script is running again, louder, broader, and aimed not only at Russians. It's a message for Washington, Brussels, and every capital still pretending the conflict can be contained. The subtext is clear. You may think you're helping Ukraine, but from our perspective, you're already combatants. That sentence changes everything because it redefines what Moscow sees as legitimate targets and acceptable risks. This is how wars expand, not through surprise attacks, but through language that makes confrontation sound inevitable. Fear spreads faster than fire, and words are its oxygen. Because if the language of war spreads faster than the war itself, that's when mistakes happen. Medvedev's sentence wasn't meant to inform. It was meant to condition. In the architecture of Russian power, words are not commentary, they are instruments. When he said, "We are at war with the West," The message didn't travel in one direction. It radiated outward through three distinct audiences, each chosen with surgical precision. Inside Russia, it was a signal of unity through fear. After years of sanctions, casualties, and quiet disillusionment, the Kremlin needed to replace fatigue with purpose. That line did it instantly. On Russian state television, anchors repeated the phrase within hours, framing it as proof that the nation is under siege. Fear became the new social glue. A mother watching the news in Yekaterinburg no longer sees her son's deployment as a sacrifice for distant territory. She sees it as a defense of her home. A factory worker in Tver hears war with the West and accepts shortages as evidence of patriotism. In that psychological loop, every hardship becomes validation. Every loss becomes fuel. The system survives because the threat feels real. But the second audience was never domestic. It was us. To Washington, to Brussels, to anyone listening in English, the phrase is meant to distort the boundary between tension and open conflict. It tells Western governments, from our point of view, you're already in the war. That's a dangerous recalibration because it makes every future Russian move look defensive, even preemptive. Suddenly, a cyber attack is not aggression, it's retaliation. A missile test is not provocation, it's deterrence. The psychology flips, and the West is forced to decide, respond and risk escalation, or remain silent and appear weak. Both outcomes feed the same Russian objective, uncertainty, and uncertainty spreads faster than panic. The third layer is subtler, aimed at the undecided world, the nations balancing between blocks, watching from Delhi, Brasilia, or Pretoria. For them, Medvedev's phrase reframes the entire conflict. It is no longer Russia against Ukraine, but Russia against the West. Supporting Moscow becomes a statement of sovereignty, a rejection of Western dominance. That narrative resonates in countries still marked by the memory of colonial hierarchies. It's not military alignment, it's ideological leverage. So this single line works like a prism. Each audience sees a different reflection: unity, intimidation, defiance, but all converge toward one goal: to expand the space where fear feels justified. That is strategic communication at its purest form. It costs nothing. It travels at the speed of repetition, and it alters the environment without firing a shot. If this is the message, who is supposed to hear it, and who is supposed to fear it? Because in Moscow, fear isn't collateral damage, it's policy. Fear, once planted, has to be maintained. And that is where timing becomes everything. Medvedev's declaration didn't appear out of nowhere, it landed like a cue in a larger performance. When he said, "We are at war with the West," Russia was not advancing, it was holding. According to Reuters, by late October, the fighting along the Eastern Front had slowed into a grinding stalemate, with neither side gaining meaningful ground. Moscow needed momentum, not necessarily on the battlefield, but in perception. So it moved the front line into the narrative itself. By redefining the war as a clash of civilizations, the Kremlin turned exhaustion into resolve. A campaign without progress became proof of endurance. Every day without defeat was reframed as defiance. This is a classic move in Russian statecraft. When physical space cannot be gained, psychological space must expand. It's not about where the troops stand, it's about what the public believes they're standing for. At the same time, NATO's posture was visibly hardening. In the Baltic and the Mediterranean, alliance exercises intensified. According to the Associated Press, U.S. forces quietly deployed additional naval assets to the Caribbean, officially for training and maritime security. In Moscow, those events were not seen as coincidence. State media played Medvedev's words over footage of Western warships, turning parallel realities into proof of encirclement. That's how information warfare operates. It fuses correlation into causality until perception replaces evidence. And perception, when amplified, becomes pressure. In the Kremlin's logic, every Western movement near Russian borders, or even near Russian allies, can now be framed as hostile intent. That framing does more than justify Russia's posture. It creates the pretext for escalation, diplomatic or military. Timing amplifies meaning, and meaning prepares action. Economically, the moment was just as fragile. Russia was entering another winter under sanctions. Energy exports were tightening, inflation rising, and budget reserves draining faster than expected. In that context, Medvedev's statement did more than shape public opinion. It shaped endurance. By defining the struggle as a war with the West, the Kremlin transformed scarcity into virtue. It was no longer about the price of bread, it was about the price of sovereignty. Shortages became symbols. Endurance became identity. So the timing wasn't accidental, it was strategic. The statement arrived exactly when Moscow had the least to gain militarily, but the most to lose psychologically. When momentum falters, narrative fills the void. That is why in Russia, language and strategy evolve together. The words change first, the actions follow. And the next phase may not unfold in Europe. And that is where the echo of Medvedev's words reaches Washington. Because once Moscow frames the conflict as a war with the West, it's not just a message sent abroad, it's a test delivered to the United States. Every statement like this forces a choice, to respond or to remain silent. Both paths carry risk, and both are anticipated in the Kremlin's playbook. A strong reaction validates Russia's claim that the West is hostile and aggressive. Silence, on the other hand, signals hesitation, proof that the message has already achieved its purpose. Either outcome pulls Washington into Moscow's rhythm, forcing it to react to Russia's narrative rather than its actions. This is the logic of strategic signaling. In a conventional war, progress is measured in territory. In an information war, it's measured in reactions. The Kremlin knows that a single sentence, amplified through Western media, can trigger a chain of responses, emergency meetings, cautious statements, and days of televised debate that split public opinion long before any real event occurs. According to the Associated Press, after Medvedev's comments, U.S. officials were pressed to clarify that no state of war exists between Russia and the West, a denial that also confirmed how deeply the words had penetrated. That's the paradox of the information battlefield. Defending against a narrative often means repeating it. Inside the United States, this kind of pressure lands on fertile ground. The country is already polarized, and every external threat now doubles as an internal argument. One side warns of weakness, the other of escalation, and the noise itself becomes the weapon. Russian information operators have studied this rhythm for years. Amplify division, accelerate outrage, and let democracy turn its own openness into vulnerability. It doesn't require hacking systems, just feeding narratives that the system will amplify for free. The ripple effect extends beyond politics. Financial markets absorb tension instantly. A rumor about confrontation can shake oil prices, send defense stocks surging, and dominate the news cycle for days. In a hyper-connected society, perception doesn't move at the speed of truth, it moves at the speed of reaction. And in a global information war, perception can collapse faster than defense lines. That's the real vulnerability. America's strength has always depended on its ability to define the terms of conflict, when, how, and against whom. But if Russia can rewrite those terms through language alone, the United States risks fighting on a battlefield it didn't choose. This isn't about nuclear arsenals or conventional firepower. It's about who controls the frame that shapes every subsequent decision, from policy to public mood. So when Moscow says war, the question isn't whether we believe it, it's whether we're ready for what believing it could cause. Wars today don't start with armies crossing borders. They start when nations stop questioning the meaning of war itself. Medvedev didn't declare a new conflict, he redrew the psychological map of the one already underway. By calling it a war with the West, Russia isn't changing the facts on the ground. It's changing how the world interprets them. That shift sounds abstract, but it's the foundation of modern escalation. Because the moment language defines a state of war, everything that follows, military action, economic retaliation, diplomatic collapse, becomes a reaction, not a choice. This is the true battlefield of the 21st century. It isn't only fought with missiles or sanctions, but with narratives that decide which actions feel legitimate and which do not. Once the frame is accepted, it governs everything that comes after. History has shown how powerful that can be. The Cold War didn't begin with combat. It began with words, speeches, and doctrines that slowly hardened into front lines. The same process is unfolding again, only faster, amplified by networks that can turn a phrase into policy overnight. Understanding this isn't fear, it's awareness. Awareness of how strategy has evolved and how power now moves through perception as much as through force. For Americans, that awareness is not optional. It's the difference between reacting to events and recognizing their design. Medvedev's statement is a warning, but not in the way headlines suggest. It's a reminder that in geopolitics, every word is a move, every narrative a maneuver, and every silence a position. That's how modern escalation works. It begins with language and ends with reality. And recognizing that pattern is not paranoia, it's preparation. Because if we don't control the language of conflict, someone else will control its meaning and its outcome. When Putin's closest ally says, "We are at war with the West," the question isn't whether we believe him, it's whether we understand what that belief sets in motion. Understanding the mechanics of that language is what keeps awareness from turning into panic. Because clarity is control, and control is what every side is really fighting for. If you want analysis that separates rhetoric from reality and helps you see where the next move might come from, subscribe to SafetyZone.